Hi, students of Paul. It's a pleasure to be with you again right now, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about history and about the importance of setting Paul in context. We've talked about that a little bit in a couple of PowerPoints, and now we're going to be talking about specific historical contexts for Paul. One of which is the Greek culture and the apocalyptic worldview that within which Paul lived and worked and traveled. And as usual, I'm trying to use images that I've taken myself or of things that I've taken in museums or in churches or elsewhere in historical sites. And so the one on the far right is taken from Pompeii, the one in the middle, I think, from the British Library, and the one from the left, I don't remember anymore. All right, let's keep going. And so it's today what we're talking about is the historical background, the context for Paul, specifically the Greek context for Paul. All right. One of the first things to keep in mind is that when we're talking about Paul, there was no Jewish world apart from Greek cultural influence. Decades ago, I remember there was a brief period of time, a long time ago, when people wore these little pins in biblical studies that said things like think Hebrew or think Jewish. And the idea was that you were supposed to separate somehow Athens from Jerusalem, that these were two completely different worldviews. And it was worthwhile to remember that, in fact, Athens is not Jerusalem, and nor was it in the first century. But in fact, we've kind of swung around in biblical studies again to the idea that instead of talking about Judaism on the one side and Greek culture on the other, like Paul often does, Paul will talk about Jew or Greek. We need to keep in mind when we're talking about the real context of the first century and of Paul's letters, that in fact, all Judaism within the Mediterranean world was Hellenistic Judaism or Hellenically influenced Judaism, Greek influenced Judaism. There was no Jewish world apart from Greek cultural influence. And why did this happen? Well, you could say one simple answer is Alexander the Great, who kind of got it all going. But of course, it's much more nuanced and complex than that. In this talk, we're not going to go through all of that. We're just going to kind of paint the broad strokes of the ancient Greek influenced world. So direct rule of Palestine from 333 to 167 in some way. There was a Greek leader influenced rule of Palestine, of ancient Judea and its environs at that time. Hellenic culture continued on as an influence into the Roman period as well. So even once the Romans took over, it was still Greek culture in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's why things like, if you've ever seen the movie The Passion of the Christ, the director Mel Gibson, lots of other issues with Mel Gibson, by the way, but one of the things he said he tried to do was to have his people speaking the languages that they would be speaking. So he had his Roman soldiers, these poor actors, trying to speak Latin to each other in the movie. In fact, he got it wrong, because almost certainly Roman soldiers in Judea at the time of Jesus's crucifixion would have been speaking Greek to each other. Unless they would say you had two Goths, they would have been speaking Gothic language to each other, or two Syrians would have been speaking Assyrian language, whatever it might have been. But in general, the language that everyone spoke was Greek, even the Romans in the Eastern Mediterranean during Jesus' and Paul's time. So Alexander the Great conquers the known world 333 BCE. Why is this important? Well, it kind of set the tone for the next few centuries. And let's see how. From 336 to 323 BCE, the young Alexander and his army swept east from Macedonia. If you ever get a chance in northern Greece, you can see probably the tomb of Philip, Alexander the Great's father. Anyway, Alexander swept aside the last of the Persian Empire and conquered the known world to the borders of India. There's a place that I happen to be lucky enough to go to where it's a kind of the swimming place in Macedonia, hot springs, where it is said by tradition that Alexander dipped the hoof of his horse in this water and said, "I will not clean off the mud from this bathing pool until I do this in Persia, in the capital of Persia." Alexander left no heirs, but he did leave a legacy that lasts to today of Greek culture and learning called Hellenism. And Alexander died at a very young age. There's an image on the right that you see of Alexander taken from, again, a a fresco from Pompeii that is now in the museum in Naples. I had the good fortune to be able to take that photograph a couple of years ago. Alexander died, his generals take over, and his generals, the Seleucids in Asia Minor and Ptolemies in Egypt, we don't need to remember the details necessarily, except to remember that his generals, even though they fought with each other constantly and over the coming centuries developed their own little kingdoms here and there, but they all continued the basic program that Alexander had started. So there's Alexander's brief empire going all the way to India in the east, from Macedonia in the west, and then south into Egypt. And that basic program that the generals continued, and that was continued all through the influenced world after Alexander the Great was gone, we call Hellenism. Hellenism acted as an incredibly strong force for assimilation of people and cultures. And although it's not the same, we think of it as an analog might be the globalized American culture today. So many Jews, followers of only one God in an ancient world that was full of gods, they were followers of only one God, and anti-syncretistic, reacted against certain aspects of Hellenism. And why? Because Hellenism was syncretistic by its very nature. Yet most ancient Jews also actively participated in the global urban culture of the Mediterranean world. This is why you can't say sort of Judaism on the one side and Greek culture on the other, because it's like saying, I don't know, about the Jewish community of Montreal. Is somebody Jewish or a Montrealer? Absolutely not. There are Jewish Montrealers if they're in Montreal, if a Jew is in Montreal, or there are Italian Montrealers or Armenian Montrealers or whatever it might be. Same here, overlapping identities. And so this idea that there's a dichotomy between ancient Judaism and ancient Greek culture is not really appropriate, not really accurate for the context of the day. Yet there were certain Jews who reacted against certain aspects of Hellenism, and that's where the flashpoints is what we want to get at here. Most ancient Jews also participated in the so-called global culture. Historic flashpoints that we know of, when they happened, were a breakdown of the usual syncretism. Syncretism means the melding, the merging of a couple of different traditions or beliefs. Hellenism was known for its syncretistic tendencies, and Judaism for its non-syncretistic tendencies, and so that's where the problems were when they happened. So the problems when they did happen tended to concern the most obvious symbols of Second Temple Judaism: circumcision and the temple. Circumcision for most Greeks and most Greek-influenced peoples, which meant basically most peoples in the ancient Mediterranean world, circumcision was deformity, was considered a deformity, and considered ridiculous, or a sign of deformation, or when you deform something. In any case, the temple also was a flashpoint, because well, we'll get into that. Note that these were also the very important concerns of Paul. So what are the kinds of things where Paul particularly gets into trouble in some of his writings, or where he gets angry particularly about the issues between non-Jewish followers and Jewish followers of Jesus, particularly around circumcision, especially, less so around the temple, but especially around circumcision. All right, let's keep going. The Hellenistic era. Although it began in the 4th century BCE with Alexander the Great, the so-called Hellenistic period overlaps the later Roman period. And sometimes you'll hear this term Greco-Roman. It's not, I think probably ancient historians for the most part don't like the term, because it's Greek is one thing and Roman is another, and they're not the same. Greco-Roman kind of says that they're all the same when they weren't. Yet at the same time, the Romans continued the sort of assimilative and syncretistic practices that had begun earlier in the Hellenistic world, or the Hellenic world. And some aspects of Hellenism included an international language, which is Koine, or Common Greek. So the New Testament, including all of Paul's letters, is written in Koine, or Common Greek. Interestingly, Jesus spoke Aramaic. So the New Testament, the canonical books of the New Testament, are written in a language different from what Jesus spoke. And Paul wrote his letters in a language different from what Jesus spoke. But this was the English of the 1st century, so to speak. It was the common language that everyone spoke, or very many people spoke a little bit of, especially in the cities where Paul moved. So aspects of Hellenism: an international language. Secondly, a spreading urban culture. supported by education and temples, where local elites were the first and most Hellenized. Actually, in a globalized world, this sounds kind of familiar to us, because it's true that very often the sort of urban inhabitants of Montreal have more sometimes in common with the urban inhabitants of London or of Los Angeles than they do with the rural inhabitants of Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean or of Eyebrow, Saskatchewan. And in the ancient world, it was a bit like this. The cities had a kind of a culture where people moved back and forth between the cities, and the culture of the cities was roughly similar in some ways. And this was a result of the fact that Alexander had planted cities as a way of spreading Greek culture. So an international language, common Greek, Koine Greek, spreading urban culture supported by education and temples, syncretistic religious impulses that combined aspects of many religions. So the Greeks would simply say, oh, great, you have a head god, that's just Jupiter, by another name. And finally, a civic awareness of transnational cosmopolitan citizenship of the Hellenic world. What does that mean? A civic awareness of transnational cosmopolitan citizenship of the Hellenic world. It means you didn't have to be Greek to call yourself a Greek. There were Greeks and there were barbarians. And if you were educated, it didn't matter if you were in, I don't know, in Antioch. Outside of Greek proper, if you were educated in a Greek way, if you used rhetoric, if you spoke Koine Greek or otherwise Greek and had studied the masters, you were Greek, so to speak. And so Greek became a kind of a cultural category for a whole bunch of de-educated people, and everyone else was barbarian. Bar. They spoke a barbaric language that sounded like barbarian, bar. And so what happens is you get this kind of a globalized, at least around the Mediterranean, globalized culture. Why is this important? Paul participates in this in the first century. Paul is very much a part of this culture. Jesus, a little less so. Hellenization, let's talk more. On the left, the gymnasium, or the gymnasium. It's where the English word gymnasium that you shoot baskets in comes from gymnasium. In Europe, gymnasium is still a school, and that's in the ancient world what it was, a school. So gymnasia, or schools, for Greek, were established everywhere. They socialized the young, especially of the elite. If you were not elite, you didn't go to school. But it socialized the young, usually the males of the elite, and made them Greeks. So in other words, this is why you could be 1,000 miles away from Greece, but if you were trained in this way, you became a Greek, and you thought of yourself as a Greek, and everyone else as a barbarian. In these gymnasia, they learned Greek rhetoric, which is a certain way of speaking and arguing, and Greek literature, especially Homer. Finally, you participated in some version of physical education, which especially in the first century and before that in these Greek cities was wrestling for men, for young men, and other sports, and it was always done naked. So this is a particularly fraught situation for young Jewish men who were circumcised because they were considered deformed, or that they had somehow been had violence done to their bodies. And so there is actually I co-wrote a paper one time called "The First Cut is the Deepest." You can look it up sometime. "The First Cut is the Deepest," about circumcision in Paul and the problems that this caused for his non-Jewish and Jewish, the non-Jewish converts to the Jesus movement. So on the right-hand side, you've got Greek religion. Greekified, and I use that term, they weren't actually always Greek, but they were Greekified. In other words, they'd been trained in this way to culturally become Greek. Greekified rulers rarely forbid local worship. So it wasn't a totalitarian state in that way, remember, this was over a 300-year period, many states, but this culture wasn't totalitarian in the way that it forbid local worship. It just kind of took it over and assimilated it. It was syncretistic, meaning local deities were identified with Greek gods. Amun-Re becomes Zeus, or becomes Jupiter. Zeus becomes Jupiter, and on and on. Another way of Hellenizing local religion. You kind of adopt it and you just bring it into the pantheon. Some Jews were a radical exception to this generally accepted practice. Again, not all Jews. There's evidence that many Jews in the ancient world were syncretistic along with everyone else. But some Jews resisted this practice, and that created what we're going to be talking about next. the tensions. Let me get myself out of the way here. So some of the tensions. If I were to ever ask you on an exam, what were the two traditional fears of pagans, of non-Jews, on the part of Jews? What did Jews feel that non-Jews were particularly prone to in the biblical record and in other scriptural writings? Firstly, idolatry, and second, immorality arising from idolatry. So these were the most common complaints of non-Jews, were that they were idolatrous and that they were immoral. And you hear this repeated again and again in the Hebrew scriptures, especially of the pagan world, of the non-Jewish world. But what were some of the tensions? Let me get rid of that. Some of the tensions: universal Greek versus particular Jewish culture. In practice, assimilation and accommodation. In practice, it almost always worked out. Hellenism worked through the institutions, as I said: city layouts and government, education through rhetoric, language, common or Koine Greek, culture and religious syncretism. So let's just see. The Maccabean revolt. Now, to say that there were tensions is not to say that things did not work out. So consider, for instance, in present-day Montreal, there are tensions sometimes with the Hasidic community, for instance, in Mile End, and the wider community of Mile End. But do things generally get along? Do the communities generally get along quite well? Yes, they do. There's generally very little friction of any sort. But when there are frictions, sometimes it's about the holidays, the high holy days, sometimes about other things like that. But in general, the communities get along just fine. And think of that as an analog. Again, it's not exactly the same. But in the ancient world, even though the Jews were not syncretistic in the way that others were, in the ancient world, in general, there was a practical accommodation that worked out quite well for all concerned. Apart from these certain flashpoints, apart from circumcision, the role of the temple in some cases, sometimes the young Jewish elites and how they were trained in the gymnasia. So the Maccabean revolt, this is one of the flashpoints. In the year 167 BCE, before Christ, before Jesus, what happened was that there was a revolt. Now, why was there a revolt? There's a much longer story than this, but a series of particularly bad rulers, and Israel, or Judea, was caught in the middle between empires, as it always was, it seems. And it started in some ways as a revolt against the Hellenic influence of the Seleucid rulers of Judea. So there were a group in Syria, very close, who were overlords, basically, for Judea. And one of them in particular, who was named Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV, through a whole bunch, a long sort of complicated political scenario, asserted his influence over Judea and wanted to do things like plant a statue of himself in the temple as Zeus, in the form of Zeus, and to sacrifice a pig on the temple. He really wanted to, with local help, to completely Hellenize Jerusalem once and for all. And that was too much. So again, it was the issues with circumcision, wanted circumcision to be abolished, and the attempt to force the worship of Greek gods in the Jewish temple. The Maccabean revolt was successful. To almost everyone's surprise, it was successful in establishing briefly a semi-independent Israel. And Hanukkah, the festival of Hanukkah, is still commemorates the purification of the temple, the cleansing of the temple after these acts had been undertaken by Antiochus IV and others. So what happened? There was a successful revolt. Why is that important? It's important just on its own because it produced the Maccabean and Hasmonean rulers, but it's also important because at the time of Paul, you start to get the beginnings of the rumblings of revolt against Rome. And it's important to remember that when the beginnings of the revolt against Rome happened in the 1st century, people could still look back and go that they knew that a couple of hundred years before there had been a successful revolt against the cosmopolitan overlords. So, however, within a generation of its start, the Maccabean leaders, who then, and then their Hasmonean successors, that is the people who kind of they evolved into, were back to living like Greek princes, speaking Greek and otherwise being cosmopolitan. There's a whole lot of literature associated with this, and if you're interested in knowing more, talk to me during one of the discussion periods, and we'll talk about what's called the pseudepigrapha, full of Jewish writings in Greek coming from this period that are incredibly influential on the New Testament and on Paul. These people kept cutting deals or seeking alliances with more major powers, ending in the Roman takeover of Judea and Jerusalem in 63 BCE. What happened with the Romans was that there was a fight between two groups. One of them said to the Romans, "Can you come and help us to win against the other group?" And the Romans, as usual, were more than happy to comply. But once the Romans moved in as your ally, they were worse. They were the worst friends to have, so to speak, in that period, first century BCE, because once they came in, they just took over. And that's what happened. Pompey marched into Jerusalem 63 BCE, marched straight into the temple and straight into the Holy of Holies, which did nothing to make the Romans seem any better in the eyes of the local Jewish population. So this is part of the context for Paul. What have you got? You've got a Greek culture that is set up by centuries from 333 BCE right through until Paul lived around 50 in the Common Era. So over 300 years of Greek culture, Greek language, cosmopolitan cities, gymnasia, or these education, syncretism, religious syncretism, pressure against circumcision, all kinds of things like this. And within memory, well, not living memory, but within memory, a successful revolt against an assimilative overlord who had gone too far. So I hope that gives you some background to Paul, and we'll end it there. But thank you so much for being here for this part of the presentation on Paul.